Before we begin, we'd like to give a few thank yous.
I think that would be great. Just look at me when I should start the time. Go right ahead.
Before we begin, we'd like to thank the Brewer Foundation for giving us this amazing opportunity. While we've been in New York City, we've had the opportunity to meet and interact with so many wonderful people we never would have had the opportunity to connect with otherwise. We'd especially like to thank Mrs. Sadberry for putting together this experience and the NYU debate program for the ambassadorship, and we'd like to give a quick shout out to our ambassador, Gordon, who's in the back. Also, furthermore, we'd like to thank our friends, family, and debate teams supporting us back home, especially many of whom who are still trying to figure out how to get on the live stream. We'd especially like to thank our coaches, Bruce, Mrs. Donahue, Mrs. Pongshi, and Mrs. Fox Allen, who have been a constant source of support for us. We'd also like to congratulate the other top 8 teams and the members of Leaf Academy for making it to the final round. And we'd like to thank the Harold Pratt House for the copious amounts of Fiji water. Lastly, we'd like to thank our teammate Alex Wang and our coach for this weekend, Nia Harama. With that. William Mason affirms the resolution. Resolved. International climate accords for greenhouse gas emissions should adopt binding enforcement mechanisms. We observe that, as explained by Ulay, enforcement mechanisms fall into 2 categories, positive and negative. The affirmative postulates that the most important and pertinent issue in the matter of climate accords is the issue of compliance, or the following of guidelines and goals. This is problematic because compliance in status quo commitments is disastrously low. Guri Bang explains, while Paris scores high on participation and reasonably high on the depth of the parties' commitments, its Achilles heel will likely be compliance. Concerning long-term effectiveness, Paris does little to restructure states' incentives so as to avoid free riding. It might end up a failure. Fortunately, Ulay explains, enforcement mechanisms should be understood as those methods by which negotiators can encourage compliance. There are 5 reasons why binding enforcement mechanisms increase compliance in climate accords. First, binding enforcement mechanisms tangibly incentivize compliance in currently non-complying nations by establishing hard incentives. In the status quo, there are no binding, tangible consequences for failing to comply with accords. The opposite is true in the affirmative world. This is important because, as Jana von Stein explains, while governments' motivations in using international inducements are diverse, the inducements themselves rely on a cost-benefit logic. Thus, in order to induce compliance, countries must feel as if there is a hard incentive to do so, something exclusive to the affirmative world. Second, binding enforcement mechanisms increase the inherent ability of states to comply in climate accords. In the status quo, some countries face structural barriers to meeting goals and guidelines. There are 2 interior warrants as to how binding enforcement mechanisms solve. First, climate accords assist poorer developing countries. Barrett explains that climate accords can create positive incentives for developing countries to participate, compensating developing countries for their compliance costs, using financing to get developing countries onto a carbon-free development path. Second, BEMs spurred the development of green technologies. Jacker of NYU furthers that in accords with enforcement mechanisms, private investors of industrialized countries finance GHG emission reduction projects in developing countries parties to the accord, receiving low carbon technology. Overall, if states are more able to comply in climate accords, they will be more likely to do so. Thirdly, binding enforcement mechanisms strengthen and promote soft incentives for compliance that exist in the status quo. Currently, the only thing that pushes compliance in the status quo is non-tangible incentives such as perception and the following of norms. There are 2 interior warrants as to why enforcement mechanisms reinforce and further these pre-existing incentives. First, because however poorly countries look now when not meeting climate goals, they would be looked upon even worse when they continue to non-comply when it is easier and more advantageous to do so. Second, BEMs would better allow nation states and the general public to monitor and check on countries' progress. Plumer of the New York Times explains right now, many of Paris's pledges remain fairly opaque, and most nations have been vague on what specific policies they will take to meet them. There is no official mechanism for quantifying progress. Fourth, binding enforcement mechanisms create a culture of compliance referred to as a race to the top, which Bang defines as a, quote, snowball effect. Bang clarifies, once key countries make first steps towards cutting their emissions, others will follow suit. However, Volterra Fietta explains that in the status quo, a race to the top is skeptical due to the lack of consequences in the compliance mechanisms of the status quo, leading to the ability of countries to wiggle out of commitments. In contrast, in the affirmative world, countries are incentivized to take the first step, leading to a ratcheting effect as other countries follow. Fifth, enforcement mechanisms increase voluntary compliance. Yang explains, enforcement affirms commitment and protects the continued existence of the community for the benefit of all. Protecting and preserving normative communities can have long-term transformational benefits. If norms, interests, and identities of community members are preserved or more closely aligned with overall treaty goals and purposes, voluntary compliance will improve, and punitive corrective actions may be less necessary. The impact of compliance is massive. Compliance in climate accords is a necessity to actively mitigate climate change. Bang explains, to make a real difference for curbing climate change, agreements must achieve high compliance rates. But crucially, even if compliance isn't increased, there is intrinsic worth to the enforcement mechanisms themselves, and this is especially important. Yang explains, compliance is not the sole criterion for assessing the usefulness of traditional enforcement mechanisms. Even in domestic legal systems, the use of deterrent sanctions does not achieve perfect compliance. A complete understanding of treaty enforcement must also consider its expressive function. Yang explains two unique impacts of enforcement. First, he explains that enforcement is a necessity for the global community to set long-standing norms on the issue, as well as sending a strong signal of cooperation and moral obligation. He states, if a treaty can be seen as the expression of a consensus on norms, enforcement actions are necessary to affirm the existence of a common normative community to which all treaty parties belong. Sanctions signal disapproval and denounce the non-conforming act. They express the significance of the institution's concern with the norm violation that the other parties actually, quote, care about the treaty norms and their breach. This is critical because creating a normative community on climate change and portraying consensus on the issue is an important prerequisite to tackling this issue. There are two main impacts of creating normative communities. First, creating a consensus on the presence and impact of anthropogenic climate change solves one of the largest hindrances to global climate policy in the world today. Marcus Neild of The Guardian explains that eco-nationalist rhetoric denying climate change in key countries such as the United States, China, India, and more destroy environmental discourse on the geopolitical level. Secondly, normative communities can solve back for all negative harms because it self-cyclically removes the need for enforcement or coercion in the long term. Yang explains, protecting and preserving normative communities can have long-term transformational benefits. If norms, interests, and identities of community members are preserved or more closely aligned with overall treaty goals and purposes, voluntary compliance will improve, and punitive corrective actions may be less necessary. Secondly, Yang explains that enforcing one treaty creates a precedent that emphasizes and strengthens the rule of law and compliance in other treaties, explaining, quote, institutional deterrent sanctions strengthen the rule of law in two ways. A, they ensure that the response to a treaty violation is impartial and governed by law, and thus it is legitimate and fair. And B, they reinforce the best-known manifestation of the rule of law in all treaties, the duty to comply with treaty obligations. Thus, we affirm.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now have the opening statement from the negative team for 8 minutes.
We would first like to say a couple of thank yous.
You bet. Go right ahead.
So we also want to express our gratitude towards those who have been crucial in helping our team get this far. First, we would like to thank the Brewer Foundation, the International Public Policy Forum, and Mrs. Andrea Sandberry for organizing this competition. Next, we would like to extend our gratitude to our school, Leaf Academy, and towards our coach, Branislav Fečko-Čegin, as well as our co-debaters Jasna Cifrova, Lucia Judová, and Sara Lovecka, and formerly Sara Solárova, who all cannot be on stage with us right now. All of this would be impossible without you. We would also like to congratulate all teams who got into the Elite 8, as well as to our opponents for advancing into the final. We wish you good luck. Without further ado, Let our first speaker, Samuel, start.
Thank you, Somer. The affirmative successfully proved two things. They proved that the status quo is problematic and that compliance is important. Unfortunately for our opponent, this is not sufficient for them to win the debate, as they must show that their agreement will work as a whole, which includes attracting participation and setting strong goals. The burden of proof for the affirmative is to show why adopting binding enforcement will ensure enough compliance to succeed even with lower participation. Our burden of proof is to show that non-binding agreements are better in emission reductions because they achieve better participation despite not being perfect in achieving compliance. But before proceeding to the negative substantive, let us address few pieces of rebuttal to the affirmative model. 1. In case the non-compliant party was a major economy, sanctions will be an impossible and counterproductive measure. Smaller countries will not impose sanctions on large nations because they fear devastating economic retaliation. Thus, the largest polluters would essentially go unpunished. 2. Affirmative would presumably also use tariffs and sanctions in free trade blocs, such as the economic European area, contradicting their founding principles and taking a lot of valuable time to fight climate change. 3. The negative burden of proof is to show the exclusive benefit of non-binding accords. Hence, affirmative analysis about the importance of positive measures is not an argument for their side, because even non-binding accords can have funds for developing countries or reward nations for their successes. Thus, the only way how to reasonably assess this debate is to discuss the punitive actions which are present on the affirmative world. All in all, the affirmative cannot successfully defend this resolution if they won't clarify these issues in their next speech. Moving on to our substantive. In our substantive arguments, we will show, firstly, that non-binding accords achieve more significant participation, and secondly, that they achieve sufficient compliance of member countries. Firstly, participation. Team Affirmative completely neglected the importance of participation in this debate. The premise of this argument is that because binding accords are seen as threats to national sovereignty and their economy, countries will not sign on to them. Firstly, sovereignty. We have recently seen a rise in nationalism throughout the world with the electoral success of populist and movements such as Brexit. Such rhetoric places an emphasis on national interest and autonomy from foreign actors. Binding agreements represent the ideal target of this rhetoric, because binding accords enable the use of negative enforcement, harming the economy and citizens of the non-compliant country. This made signing them a political suicide. Scotland, a political scientist at the University of Oslo, claims in his research that when international enforcement is perceived to be associated with sovereignty issues, it may prevent support for international enforcement. We can see that binding agreements deter participation as proven by, firstly, the non-binding Basel Convention on transboundary waste. Its participation dropped from the original 186 parties by one half to only 93 parties upon adopting the legally binding ban amendment. And secondly, on another example, Montreal Protocol that adopted the legally binding Kigali Amendment, which addressed a type of greenhouse gases. The result was that the number of parties immensely decreased from 196 to only 32 parties, without the participation of US and China. Here we can see that in real world, implementing binding enforcement goals decreased participation to alarming numbers. Secondly, economy. In addition to issues with sovereignty, countries also face economic problems when joining binding agreements. Binding agreements are far more costly to implement than non-binding ones because, firstly, if a country is non-compliant, it will be punished for negative enforcement, harming the livelihoods of its citizens. Secondly, if a country is compliant, it still may have to impose sanctions in order to enforce the compliance of other countries with the accord. However, it is crucial to recognize that trade sanctions hurt both sides. Thirdly, for developed economies, staying in the accord will be extremely costly as they will have to pay for the extreme measure of positive enforcement proposed by the affirmative, no matter what economic situations they are in. All of these reasons add an economic incentive to reject the agreement, drastically harming its participation. Why is this important? Firstly, participation is crucial for the success of an agreement, as real progress in fighting climate change can only be achieved when an overwhelming majority of polluting countries agree to reduce their emissions. Secondly, participation leads to positive media attention as agreements with more signatories draw more press attention in all countries. Positive media attention is crucial to inform society and press the establishment to fight climate change. and thirdly, China and the US. Furthermore, this debate is not only about amount of signatories, but especially the ones polluting the most. We argue that the world's two largest polluters, the United States and China, who together account for 41.19% of global emissions, are unwilling to ratify a binding accord. Christy Ashton said of 538 rights. The US Senate and China proclaimed that they refuse to ratify any binding accord and are only willing to address climate change by voluntary means. John Cassidy from The New Yorker furthers that the only way to ensure the participation of the United States and China was to make the agreement non-binding. Given that the United States and China are enormous polluters, including them in an accord is crucial for its success. Binding accords fail to do this, thus losing out on the empirical comparative. Our second argument, compliance. Non-binding accords push nations towards meeting their commitments, as signatory countries face pressure to meet their goals, which comes from two sources. Firstly, international. Countries will use peer pressure to keep other nations accountable to the agreement because they recognize the severity of climate change. Potentially withdrawing countries are aware of the potential aggravation of international relations, exclusion from further negotiations, and loss of global leadership position. Secondly, domestic. Hovey and Scotland suggest domestic pressure from NGOs and civil society will compel governments of non-binding accords to remain compliant. Hence, even if a national government decides to withdraw from an agreement, civil society pushes local governments to uphold environmental regulations, as was the case when President Trump decided to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement, which sparked a response among local governments, forming the Chicago Climate Charter, a 67-city pact to fight climate change. To conclude, the peer pressure will therefore be effective as an enforcement mechanism, yet it will not deter countries from participating as on comparative binding enforcement would. Even if, having the less compliance, the respective reduction commitments under non-binding accords are more ambitious. To avoid punishment, countries set the goals as low as possible in binding accords, ensuring that they meet them even without significant effort. As Fergus Green of LSE says, stronger bindingness in climate agreements has a strongly depressive effect on the ambition of key emitters. Conversely, as indicated by Henning Bang from the University of Oslo, in non-binding accords, countries can strive towards more stringent goals without fearing the consequence of failure. In conclusion, the negatives showed you first that binding enforcement deters participation, and second, that non-binding enforcement ensures significant compliance.
Thank you very much.